the morning the world shook. The farmer's name has been lost to history, but his cornfield has not. On the morning of September 17, 1862, the 24 acres of standing corn belonging to David R. Miller on the outskirts of Sharpsburg, Maryland, were about to become the most blood-soaked ground in American military history. The stalks were still green. The ears were nearly ready to harvest. By noon, not a single stalk would be left standing. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had crossed the Potomac River 6 days earlier, a bold, desperate gamble. His men were ragged, many marching barefoot, their clothes falling apart, their rations down to green corn and unripe apples plucked from the roadside. Yet they moved with absolute certainty. They were winning the war. The Confederate victories of 1862 had been stunning. Second Bull Run, Cedar Mountain, Harper's Ferry. Lee believed one decisive blow on Northern soil would break Union morale, force European recognition, and end the war. Major General George B. McClellan, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, had something Lee did not: the enemy's battle plan. A Union corporal had found a lost copy of Lee's orders, Special Order 191, wrapped around 3 cigars in a Maryland field. McClellan held victory in his hands. He moved, slowly. Too slowly, by any military reckoning. He had 87,000 men. Lee had barely 45,000, spread across miles of hostile terrain. But McClellan was a cautious man, pathologically afraid of defeat, always estimating enemy numbers at twice their actual size. On the evening of September 16, the two armies settled into position along Antietam Creek, a shallow, winding stream that gave the battle its name. The night was cold and still. Men on both sides wrote letters home, sharpened bayonets, and tried to sleep on the cold Maryland earth. Many of those letters would never be answered. Dawn on September 17 came gray and misty. At precisely 6 a.m., the battle began not with a single shot but with a roar, 150,000 muskets and over 200 artillery cannons opening simultaneously along a 3-mile front. The sound was heard 70 miles away. Windows shattered in Hagerstown. Horses in Washington, D.C., reared in panic. The first assault crashed through Miller's cornfield. General Joseph Hooker sent his first corps forward in a wall of blue. Confederate artillery fired into them at point-blank range. Men were not simply shot. They were disassembled. The mini-ball, a conical lead bullet half an inch in diameter, did not pass cleanly through flesh. It tumbled. It expanded. It shattered bone into dozens of fragments, each fragment tearing its own jagged path through muscle and organ. Men shot through the fire didn't bleed, they sprayed. In less than an hour of fighting in the cornfield alone, over 8,000 men became casualties. A 24-acre field that had held corn that morning held only the dead. By 7 a.m. General Hooker would write afterward that in his long military career, he had never seen anything like it. Men lay so thick on the ground, he said, that one could walk from one end of the field to the other without once touching the earth. Bloody Lane. While the cornfield burned with violence, the battle shifted south. A sunken farm road, worn down over decades of wagon traffic until it sat a foot below the surrounding fields, offered Confederate soldiers a perfect natural trench. General D.H. Hill packed his men into it 3 deep. For the Union attackers approaching across open ground, it was a killing corridor from which there seemed to be no escape. For nearly 4 hours, the Irish Brigade, 1,200 men mostly born in Ireland, wearing sprigs of green boxwood in their caps, charged the sunken road again and again. They were cut down in rows. One regiment, the 69th New York, lost over 60% of its men in under 20 minutes. Their commanding general, Thomas Moore, had his horse shot out from beneath him. He was thrown to the ground, stunned and bleeding from the mouth, and had to be carried from the field. When Union forces finally found an angle of attack and poured enfilading fire down the length of the road, the result was apocalyptic. Confederates who had been fighting safely from their trench suddenly found bullets sweeping horizontally along their entire line. Men were shot while standing, fell onto other men who had already been shot, and were shot again. The sunken road filled not with mud but with bodies, stacked 2 and 3 high. Survivors described having to stand on the dead simply to peer over the edge and fire. A Confederate soldier named John Gordon would recall that 5 separate bullets struck him that day, through his right leg, his left arm, his shoulder, twice through his back, and the final shot directly through his left cheek and out his jaw. His face fell forward into his hat, the pooling blood nearly drowning him before a fellow soldier dragged him clear. Gordon survived. He would later become a United States Senator. After the battle, soldiers on both sides who approached the sunken road described something that would remain in their nightmares for decades. The lane was no longer a road. It had become, as one Union soldier wrote, a river of red. The bodies were so numerous, so tightly packed, that for several hundred yards the road surface was invisible. Only the dead, lying as they had fallen, some still gripping their rifles, some with mouths open mid-scream, many with expressions of absolute shock, formed the new ground. The name Bloody Lane required no explanation. It explained itself. The lower bridge, Burnside's Folly. On the southern end of the battlefield, General Ambrose Burnside had a problem. He needed to cross Antietam Creek to attack Lee's right flank. The creek at this point was shallow, barely waist-deep in most places. A soldier could wade across in 2 minutes. But Burnside, following orders, focused his entire effort on a single 125-foot stone bridge. 3 times he sent men charging down a narrow road to cross it. 3 times Confederate sharpshooters on the high bluff above picked them apart. The 51st Pennsylvania and the 51st New York finally carried the bridge at 1 p.m., but only after extraordinary carnage. Men fell off the bridge into the creek. Some drowned, dragged under by the weight of their equipment. Others clung to the stone railings and were shot through the hands. The creek ran visibly red for an hour after the assault. When a photographer arrived days later, he would document bloated bodies still wedged against the bridge's stone pilings. By the time Burnside's 9,000 men finally crossed and began pushing toward Sharpsburg, Lee's army appeared on the verge of collapse. The Confederate right flank was crumbling. Burnside's men could see the rooftops of Sharpsburg, and beyond the town, the Potomac River, which meant cutting off Lee's retreat entirely. The war might have ended that afternoon. Then, A.P. Hill arrived. His light division had marched 17 miles from Harper's Ferry in 7 hours, one of the greatest forced marches in Civil War history, men dropping dead from exhaustion along the road, others throwing away everything they carried to keep pace. They arrived at the precise moment of crisis, smashing into Burnside's flank and driving the Union men back to the bridge they had paid so dearly to capture. By 5:30 p.m., the shooting stopped. The battle was over. What the surgeons saw. Before the guns fell silent, the surgeons had already been at work for hours. The field hospitals of Antietam were not hospitals in any modern sense. They were barns, farmhouses, churches, open fields under canvas tents, any structure within a mile or 2 of the fighting that could receive the broken and the dying. The Pry House, the Sherrick Farm, the Real Farm, the Lutheran Church in Keedysville, all became operating theaters before breakfast was finished. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, medical director of the Army of the Potomac, had arrived at his position just weeks before Antietam. He had no background in battlefield medicine. What he had was an organizing mind of extraordinary power. In August 1862, he had established the Union Army's first formal ambulance corps. Instead of regimental bandsmen, musicians who fled at the first volley, trained enlisted men with dedicated wagons would retrieve the wounded. At Antietam, Letterman's system moved all 10,000 Union wounded from the battlefield to field hospitals within 24 hours. It was a miracle of logistics performed against a backdrop of absolute horror. What the surgeons found when the wounded arrived defied every peacetime standard of medicine these men had trained for. Most Civil War surgeons were graduates of 2-year unregulated medical schools. Before the war, the majority had never treated a single gunshot wound. Now they faced 10,000 in a single day. The mini-ball, the standard ammunition of both armies, was not a bullet in the modern sense. It was a soft lead cone, .58 caliber, that could be dropped loose down a rifle barrel and would expand upon firing to grip the rifling. When it struck bone, it did not make a clean hole. It exploded the bone into fragments, sometimes dozens of sharp shards driven in every direction through the surrounding muscle. A surgeon examining a man shot through the thigh would find not a broken femur but a femur pulverized, with bone chips scattered through the leg in a pattern resembling a grenade wound. The standard treatment was amputation. This has been misunderstood by every generation since as barbarism, as surgeons being butchers, hacking off limbs with gleeful indiscriminate fury. The reality was grimmer and more defensible. In 1862, there were no antibiotics. There was no understanding of germ theory. Joseph Lister's antiseptic methods were still 4 years away from publication. A shattered thigh bone that was left in place would almost certainly develop gas gangrene within 72 hours, a bacterial infection that consumed flesh at visible speed, turning tissue black, generating a smell witnesses described as indescribable, and killing its victim within days in agony. Amputation within the first 48 hours gave a soldier roughly a 73% chance of survival. Waiting 3 days dropped survival odds to 48%. The surgeons knew this. They were not amputating because they enjoyed it. They were amputating because it was the only tool that reliably prevented death, and they had thousands of men to treat and hours in which to treat them. The operating table. The surgical procedure itself took, in practiced hands, less than 10 minutes from first incision to tied arteries. A surgeon would take a scalpel and cut through the skin in a circular or flap pattern around the limb. A Catlin knife, long, double-edged, swept through the muscle. Then the bone saw. Civil War slang called surgeons sawbones, and the name was literal. A straight-bladed bone saw, not dissimilar to a carpenter's tool, severed the bone with 4 to 8 strokes. The arteries were ligated, tied off, with silk, cotton, or horsehair thread. The wound was closed with the skin flap and dressed with lint soaked in water. Chloroform was administered in over 95% of operations, dripped onto a folded cloth held over the patient's face until unconsciousness came, usually within 60 seconds. The claim that surgeons routinely operated on screaming, conscious men is a myth, but it was a myth soldiers chose to believe rather than face the operating table. Some men hid in the woods rather than be found by surgeons. Some removed their own bullets with penknives. At least one Antietam veteran was found 2 days after the battle, having fashioned a tourniquet from his own belt and crawled 4 miles from where he fell. Outside every major field hospital at Antietam, within hours of the battle's opening, there appeared what soldiers called the pile, a heap of amputated arms and legs that grew through the day into a mound as tall as a man. Walt Whitman, the poet who served as a hospital volunteer later in the war, described seeing similar piles at other battles and being unable to process the sight. Each limb had been someone's arm that morning, someone's hand that had written a letter, someone's leg that had walked 20 miles the day before. The piles at Antietam were visible from the road. Civilians driving relief wagons had to pass them to reach the hospital doors. Clara Barton and the Angel on the field. Clara Barton was 40 years old on the morning of the Battle of Antietam. She was not a trained nurse. She was a former school teacher and patent office clerk who had, without authorization or salary, spent the previous year loading supply wagons with food, bandages, candles, and medicine, items the Union Army chronically failed to provide in adequate quantities, and driving them to the front lines herself. She arrived at the Pry House Field Hospital while the battle was still raging, her wagon loaded with dressings, wine, whiskey, and food. Dr. James Dunn, overwhelmed and working from a supply of torn bedsheets, reportedly wept when he saw her pull up. The surgeons had already torn every bandage, sheet, and piece of cloth they could find. Barton's wagon appeared like a miracle. Barton worked through the night and into the following day without stopping. She later wrote of lifting a wounded man's head to give him water when a bullet passed through her sleeve and struck the man she was holding, killing him instantly. She was uninjured. She left the hole in her sleeve as it was for the rest of the war. "I have a bullet hole in my sleeve," she told a friend years later, but no one was ever near a death without dying. She dressed wounds, administered morphine and whiskey, held men's hands as they died, and organized the hospital's food supply when surgeons had eaten nothing in 36 hours. Nearby, in other hospitals scattered across the Sharpsburg area, the Catholic Sisters of Charity moved through wards with the same terrible efficiency. Women who had volunteered because hospitals needed people capable of witnessing horror and continuing to work. The wounds themselves. The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, a 6,000-page medical document compiled after the war, contains case histories of individual Antietam wounds that read like dispatches from another world. Private William Johnson, 14th Indiana, was struck by a mini ball that entered his face below the left eye, traveled through both nasal passages, destroyed his right cheekbone, and lodged behind his right ear. He was conscious throughout. Surgeons extracted the bullet through a half-inch incision behind his ear. He survived and returned to duty 4 months later. Corporal Ezra Stiles, 8th Connecticut, lost his lower jaw to a canister shot, a tin can filled with iron balls, fired from a cannon at close range, that opened like a shotgun blast. The shot carried away Stiles' entire mandible from ear to ear. He lived. Surgeons reconstructed a partial jaw from silver wire and carved ivory. He would spend the next 30 years eating only liquids. He outlived most of his regiment. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, 63rd New York, Irish Brigade, was shot through both thighs simultaneously as he crossed the cornfield. Both femoral arteries were nicked but not severed. A surgeon performing triage determined he would die and marked him for morphine comfort only. A second surgeon disagreed, lanced both wounds, applied pressure dressings, and O'Brien survived. He was discharged as permanently disabled in 1863. He lived until 1901. The chest wound was considered a death sentence. Surgeons had no way to operate inside the thoracic cavity, no ventilators, no sterile technique, no means of controlling bleeding inside the chest. A man shot through the lung who did not die on the field typically died of pneumonia within a week. Of the 1,300 Union soldiers recorded as having chest wounds at Antietam, fewer than 200 survived. The Confederate records are incomplete, but the ratio was likely similar. Abdominal wounds were worse. A mini ball through the abdomen typically ruptured the intestines, spilling fecal matter into the peritoneal cavity. Before antibiotics, peritonitis from this contamination was essentially 100% fatal within 3 to 5 days. Surgeons at Antietam categorized men with abdominal wounds as mortal, given morphine and set aside, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing surgery could accomplish. The men with gut wounds knew this. They had seen it happen to others. The photography of death. Alexander Gardner arrived at Antietam 3 days after the battle with his glassplate camera equipment and a young assistant. He was a Scottish-born photographer working for Matthew Brady's studio in Washington. What he produced over the following days would change American culture forever. Gardner's photographs of the Antietam dead, published under the title The Dead of Antietam at Brady's New York Gallery in October 1862, were the first photographs of battlefield dead ever shown to the American public. New Yorkers stood in silent, horrified lines to view them. A New York Times reporter described the experience of viewing them. "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it." The photographs Gardner took were not manipulated, not in the modern sense. But they were composed. Gardner moved bodies slightly for better framing. He repositioned rifles. At one famous photograph taken near the Dunker Church, he used the same Confederate soldier as the subject twice, photographed from different angles after moving the corpse and placing a rifle beside it for dramatic effect. The practice was not considered unethical at the time. Photography was still seen as a form of illustration. What the photographs could not convey was the smell. Every survivor account of Antietam in the days after the battle returns obsessively to the smell. It began within hours of the shooting stopping, the sweet sour stench of fresh blood, then the heavier, clinging odor of decay as the September heat accelerated decomposition. By day 2, it was detectable half a mile from the field. By day 3, when Gardner arrived, men working the burial details wore wet cloths over their faces and still retched continuously. The photographer's assistant reportedly vomited so frequently that Gardner eventually sent him back to the wagon. Gangrene, the invisible enemy. The battle ended on September 17th. The dying continued for weeks. Hospital gangrene was the nightmare that followed every Civil War battle. It was not the dry gangrene of reduced blood flow, the black, mummified extremities one might associate with frostbite. It was wet gangrene, technically a form of necrotizing fasciitis, caused by bacterial contamination of wounds in an era when surgeons operated with unwashed hands, reused sponges on dozens of patients without cleaning them, and stored surgical instruments in coat pockets between operations. Hospital gangrene could move visibly quickly. A wound that appeared to be healing on day 3 would develop a black spot by day 4. By day 5, the flesh surrounding the spot, healthy pink tissue on day 3, was gray and soft, dying. The smell was distinctive and unmistakable. Surgeons described it as intensely fetid, unlike any normal decay, a sweet rotting chemical odor that permeated hospital wards and announced new cases before the visual examination confirmed them. Treatment options were medieval by any standard. Cauterization, burning the infected tissue with a red-hot iron, was tried. Bromine solution was introduced into wounds. Silver nitrate was applied. Turpentine-soaked lint was packed into gangrenous cavities. None of these consistently worked. The only reliable treatment was radical amputation, cutting back through healthy tissue far above the gangrenous zone and hoping the infection had not spread further. Men who had already lost a lower leg found themselves losing the thigh. Men who had undergone arm amputations found surgeons returning to take more at the Smoketown Hospital near Antietam. A Union Army surgeon named Daniel Holt wrote in his personal diary entries that he had not slept in 72 hours and had performed 43 amputations in a single day. He described the operating table as never cooling. Patients came as fast as they could be processed. Between cases he ate crackers and drank creek water. His hands, he wrote, had stopped shaking 2 days earlier. He had run out of feelings. He was 29 years old. The faces of the wounded. Among the 17,000 Union wounded and the 9,000 Confederate wounded at Antietam were soldiers from every state in the Union and every state of the Confederacy. Farmers from Ohio. Fishermen from Maine. Plantation sons from Georgia. Immigrant laborers from Ireland who had stepped off ships in New York Harbor and been handed a rifle before they learned 100 English words. Private Patrick Riordan, 28th Massachusetts, arrived in America from County Cork 6 months before the battle. He spoke almost no English. He was shot through the right shoulder at the cornfield, the mini ball shattering his shoulder joint entirely. The arm was amputated at the field hospital. When the operation was done and Riordan woke from chloroform, the surgeon who spoke a little Irish attempted to tell him what had happened. Riordan, according to hospital records, said nothing. He looked at where his arm had been, turned to face the wall, and did not speak for 3 days. Lieutenant Charles Phelps, 7th Maryland, was hit by artillery shrapnel that tore open the entire left side of his face, destroying his eye socket, cheekbone, and part of his upper jaw. He was left for dead on the field. A stretcher-bearer found him alive 8 hours later, pulse faint, face wrapped in his own blood-soaked haversack. He was operated on by Dr. Reed Bontecu over 3 sessions, had pieces of bone and shrapnel removed over 14 months of hospitalization, and was eventually fitted with a prosthetic eye made from enamel. Photographs of Phelps taken at the end of the war show a man whose face tells the entire story of Antietam without a single word. The Confederate wounded presented unique challenges. Lee's army withdrew on the night of September 18, leaving their most severely injured men behind, men who could not be moved. These Confederate soldiers became prisoners of war, treated by Union surgeons in Union hospitals. The care they received was, by most accounts, equal to that given Union soldiers. Dr. Jonathan Letterman explicitly ordered equal treatment for all wounded regardless of uniform color. In at least a dozen documented Antietam cases, Confederate and Union soldiers shared the same operating table, one finished, the other begun, without changing the surgeon's technique or effort. The cost of a single day. When the final accounting was done, weeks later, after the last ambulance had run and the last field hospital had closed, the numbers were staggering. Union, 2,108 killed, 9,549 wounded, 753 missing. Confederate, approximately 1,546 killed, 7,752 wounded, 1,018 missing. Total casualties, 22,726 in one day. To put that in perspective, more Americans died at Antietam on September 17, 1862, than on D-Day, June 6, 1944. More died in that single day than in the entire American Revolution combined. More died than in all previous American wars put together up to that point. Of the 17,300 Union wounded, the vast majority, roughly 14,000, survived their wounds to reach a general hospital. Of those, approximately 1,700 would die of infection, gangrene, or surgical complications in the following weeks and months. Hundreds more would die in the years after the war of long-term complications, bone infections that persisted for decades, internal damage that slowly ended lives the battlefield had failed to claim outright. At least 500 Union soldiers at Antietam underwent amputations. Of these, those who received primary amputations within 48 hours had survival rates approaching 75%. Those who received secondary amputations, when gangrene had already set in, survived at rates below 50%. The limbs amputated at Antietam numbered in the hundreds. They were buried in pits near the field hospitals. Some of those pits were rediscovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. The legacy, how Antietam changed medicine forever. The Battle of Antietam did not just kill and wound 23,000 men. It created the modern system of emergency medical response. Jonathan Letterman's ambulance corps became the direct ancestor of every emergency medical service operating today. The triage system, sorting wounded by severity, is Letterman's invention, formalized at Antietam and still used identically in every emergency room worldwide. When you call 911 and an ambulance arrives within minutes, staffed by trained paramedics with dedicated medical equipment, following protocols for rapid assessment and transport, you are living in a world shaped by what happened at Antietam on September 17, 1862. The medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, commissioned in 1862 and finally completed in 6 massive volumes, became the foundational text of American surgical education. It documented 280,000 individual cases with unprecedented statistical rigor. It established wound classification systems, infection protocols, and amputation techniques that were still referenced in surgical textbooks into the 20th century. Plastic surgery as a field, reconstructive surgery, the repair of faces and limbs, began at Antietam in the hospitals that received its wounded. The men whose faces were rebuilt with silver wire, ivory, and enamel in 1862 were the first patients of a surgical specialty that would one day reshape medicine worldwide. Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam. He had been waiting for a Union military success before issuing it, unwilling to have it appear an act of desperation. Antietam, technically a tactical draw, was sufficient. Without the battle, without the 22,726 casualties, without the 23,000 wounds, without the rivers of blood in a sunken Maryland road, the proclamation that changed the moral direction of the war might not have been issued for months, perhaps years. Some historians argue it might never have come at all in the same form. The soldiers who came home. The men who survived Antietam, on both sides, came home to a world that had no language for what they had seen. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not be named for another century. The closest diagnosis available in 1862 was soldier's heart, a condition characterized by palpitations, anxiety, sleeplessness, and what one Union surgeon described as an habitual expression of terror on the face even in times of complete safety. Thousands of Antietam veterans spent the rest of their lives waking from nightmares of the cornfield, of Bloody Lane, of the operating table. Some drank themselves to death within a decade. Some never spoke of the war to their families, not one word, for the rest of their lives. Grandsons of Antietam veterans would sometimes, in sorting through possessions after a grandfather's death, find a locked box containing a uniform, a medal, and nothing else, a life's worth of unspeakable memory reduced to objects. And yet many came home and built remarkable lives. John Gordon, shot 5 times at Antietam, left for dead, became a U.S. Senator from Georgia and commanded the Confederate Veterans March in the Grand Review after the war. Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross in 1881, an organization that exists today because she drove a supply wagon into a burning battlefield in September 1862. Jonathan Letterman returned to civilian medicine, eventually moving to San Francisco, where he died in 1872 at 47, his health broken by years of battlefield service. What the cornfield remembers. Today, the Antietam National Battlefield is preserved almost exactly as it appeared on September 17, 1862. The stone bridge, called Burnside's Bridge, still stands. The Dunker Church has been reconstructed. Miller's cornfield is planted with corn every year. The sunken road, Bloody Lane, is open to visitors. Standing in the sunken road today, the land is peaceful. Birdsong. Wind in the corn. The fences are whitewashed, the markers are orderly, the walking paths are level and clear. Nothing in the landscape prepares you for what happened here. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. Beneath this quiet ground, the soil still holds the iron and lead of that day. Farmers plowing fields on the edges of the battlefield continue to turn up mini balls with every season's plowing. Occasional archaeological surveys recover uniform buttons, belt buckles, and once, in 2009, the partial skeletal remains of a Union soldier from a New York regiment, identified only by the buttons of his jacket. His name was never determined. He was buried with full military honors. Over 300 stone tablets mark the positions of individual regiments, where each unit stood, where each unit fell, how many each unit lost. Walking the entire battlefield and reading every tablet takes a full day. By the time you finish, the mathematics of the day have become personal. The 1st Delaware lost 230 of 650 men. The 125th Pennsylvania, in its first battle, lost 139 of 820. The 1st Texas, Confederate, lost 226 of 226 men engaged. Every single man who entered the cornfield became a casualty. The battle changed the war. It stopped the Confederate invasion of the North. It provided the occasion for the Emancipation Proclamation. It prevented European recognition of the Confederacy. It created modern emergency medicine. It produced the first photographs of American battlefield dead ever seen.